How are you doing, Nick?
Nick says he's living the dream.
Yeah, by proxy.
There's your loophole.
There you go. I'll just type it into the chat. Okay.
Well, Nick, you haven't yet shown us outside your window, which is usually the tell that it's a.
This is why I'm living the dream. There you go. Look at that. November. Oh no, December.
Yep.
That's why. And I'm in shorts.
Hello to Jerusalem.
That's a visual.
Hello.
Yeah.
Somebody from Jerusalem?
Yes.
That's fantastic. Okay. This is excellent.
Cristiano is here. Hello.
Cristiano. And Danielle. Gallery Systems. Hey, Danielle.
Oh boy, we got
Danielle, hey.
Man, this
quite a few
is an
people.
all-star.
This is a great turnout. Welcome,
Yeah.
everybody.
So, Alex, do you want to be host, or am I doing a good job?
I think you're doing a great job.
Okay.
I don't mind you doing it, and I'll just moderate.
Okay. Oh, Cogat about to come in the house.
We still got some folks filtering in, Nick.
Yeah, we have.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gavin Mallory, I'm concerned about the usability of your upside down username.
I'll just ping him off.
Problem solved.
Yeah. That sounded wildly inappropriate for some reason.
Just a smidge.
Yeah.
We've got folks from around the world. I love this.
This is
Jerusalem,
fantastic.
Ottawa.
There's Dan Brennan from New Jersey.
Jersey.
Whoa.
We are privileged. Hey, Dan.
Hey, everybody. I'm actually in Brooklyn, Chad, for the record.
Sure.
All right. Well, do we want to get this party started?
You're in charge.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to the first webinar in our new webinar series called Dreaming of a New Collections Management System. It's hosted by the Balboa Park Online Collaborative, or BPOC. My name is Alex Cron. I am BPOC's Digital Projects and Collections Specialist. Today's webinar will open this series with a panel of consultants from the museum field. On this panel, we have BPOC's Nik Honeysett, Valerie Kinkade, Chad Weinhard, and Coven Smith. Now, before I'm going to do a brief introduction to each of our panelists, starting with Nik. Before joining BPOC as CEO, Nik was head of administration for the J. Paul Getty Museum, where he led their digital transformation and engagement efforts. Prior to this role, he led the Getty's web group, and he was responsible for all aspects of the main website, intranets, and web development activities. Before moving to Los Angeles, he spent 12 years at COGAP, a UK-based software development consultancy serving the cultural sector in Europe and the USA. Now, for our next panelist, we have Valerie Kinkade. Before beginning, morning. Before beginning her company, Museum and Collector Resource, Valerie Kinkade worked for nearly 2 decades in a wide variety of museums, including the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, Frank Lloyd Wright House, and then house museums dating from the 17th and 18th centuries as a curator of the US Coast Guard Museum. Then in the 1990s, she founded Museum and Collector Resource to address a growing need for short-term museum quality collections care, registration, museum planning, exhibition development, and collections management systems consulting. Next, we have Chad Weinard, who is a technologist and strategist for museums. His recent work explores collections, cultural data, museum infrastructures, creative technology and the intersection of digital humanities and data science. Most recently, he directed the WCMA Digital, a 3-year digital infrastructure project that enhanced engagement through digital collections and data at the Williams College Museum of Art. He was director of digital media at the Balboa Park Online Collaborative, where he led a team developing mobile, web, video, and in-gallery experiences for a wide range of museums. His background is in fine arts, art history, design, and web development. He studied the history of modern and contemporary art at the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU, and interaction design at ITP NYU. Last but certainly not least, we have Koven Smith. He is a digital strategy consultant for museums and nonprofits. His work includes 20 years of managing digital projects in leadership positions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Denver Art Museum, and the Blatton Museum of Art. And as a consultant working with the Smithsonian, the Louvre Abu Dhabi, the Amon Carter Museum of American Art, and many others. He has also performed sector-wide research on behalf of the Knight Foundation, the Texas Association of Museums, the Crest Foundation, and the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. Koven has also served as adjunct faculty in the Arts Administration program at NYU and the Museum Studies program at Johns Hopkins University, my alma mater. He has been a principal investigator on the Horizon Report Museum Edition and has had board postings with the American Composers Forum, the Western Museums Association, and the Museum Computer Network. So those are our panelists today. Now, for our webinar today, as many of you are painfully aware, COVID-19 has impacted the arts and culture sector in many unprecedented ways. Because of institutional closures brought on by COVID, this year has led to many ongoing conversations around making cultural artifacts more accessible to virtual audiences. With this new urgency brought on by COVID, we would like to open these discussions to better understand how vendors can meet the end user needs. This webinar will be recorded, it is currently being recorded, and a recording link will be shared out on BPOC's LinkedIn and Twitter and YouTube channel after the webinar's conclusion. So, opening our panel discussion, I would like to ask our panelists to describe what some of their experiences have been with collections management, informational and technical needs, issues and challenges, what some of the biggest challenges that museums face in collections management systems right now and into the future. And then after each panelist has had a chance to speak, we'll open up the discussion with questions from our audience. So if you have any questions, please leave those in the chat and I will make sure that I read those off to our panelists at the end. And we will start off with Valerie.
Thanks, Alex. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So I think, Alex and Nick have talked a little bit, before this with us about, what some of the challenges are. I work mostly with smaller institutions who don't have a lot of support when it comes to IT generally. We have a lot of Native American tribal cultural centers as our clients, as well as volunteer-run museums. And we have a lot of African American institutions as well. In addition, we've got institutions that are 1, 2, maybe 3 employees as well. And these all usually outsource their IT for starters. And so they don't have kind of the support that's often necessary to really implement or to change their collections management systems. So I see that that's a big challenge in the field in general. Those companies that they're working with really have no idea, what they're trying to accomplish, what some of their data security needs are, or what the complications are for them migrating their data. So I think that that's one problem. We often get brought in when there's been a bad data move. So that can be, kind of frustrating for them. Money and time and institutional support for any change in their collection management systems is pretty prevalent. You know, a lot of my clients are also digital immigrants. They're not digital natives. They really wish things were simpler. They wish they had fewer fields to choose from. They wish they understood more about what information goes where in a database. You know, some really basic things. And you know, these are also the people who are putting out, you know, setting up the board meetings, putting out the fires within the institution. And so sometimes the collections management side of things really, you know, is kind of put to the side. Money and support is low for collections management with most of my clients. We also see that we've got some smaller contemporary art museums and regional art centers that are starting to get digital assets, and they don't know what to do with them. They really are at a loss as to how to deal with those things. So there's a real need in the field for bringing those people up to par on what has to happen with those digital collections. One of the other things that we see is that our smaller institutions don't have a good understanding of the connection between their collections management database and their web portal. You know, how are they getting that information out onto the web? How is that happening? Is it connected with their CMS or is it separate? And the very little choice in going into their CMSs had anything to do with what maybe their output might be in the end. So I think sometimes that's a little frustrating for them.
Right.
I think also that, you know, we really have been trying to push training a lot with our clients, and also data collection standards. That's probably the biggest area that I see that there's a big disconnect with, is understanding what those data collection standards need to be before getting to actually choosing even a CMS. And understanding the process and understanding what data cleanup is, especially if you're going to try to switch over to a new collections management system. I think all these things have been issues that we're dealing with on pretty much a daily basis for our clients. So those are the things that we see as some of the problems out there and some of the issues that I'd like to see the vendors address a little bit more, and also maybe the field as well. So that's my start for today.
Thank you, Valerie, for that. All right, Chad. So what have your experiences been with challenges with collections management systems?
Yeah, the collections management systems, you know, when I started in museum technology around about 2008, I remember sitting down with the registrar, looking at the collections management system, and even at that point saying, whoa, this is way out of date. This is going to change soon. I'm sure it's going to get better in the next couple of years. And that was 12 years ago. And the systems we use are the same, and they look the same, and they're just as hard to use, if not harder now, because our demands are greater. Yeah, so what's wrong with CMSs? It's hard to get data out of them. You know, from a technologist point of view, it shouldn't be so difficult. It's hard to get data into them. If you're not that sole registrar or collections manager sitting in front of the terminal, it can be a struggle. And they also lead to, as we were saying a little bit, some poor workflows and some organizational practice that's not ideal. If you look back at the history of CMSs, collections management systems, it all makes sense. Like, these were, you know, they were born as inventory databases, and they were meant to facilitate the physical handling of these objects. And so it makes sense in a way. And they were also, you know, built with 1990s technology at the beginning. And that meant that they were, you know, on a server sitting beside you, and only a few people could have access to it. And, you know, you bought those seats with a physical kind of license by seat. And that necessitated a certain kind of organizational structure around it, right? And so that's all changed now. we're in a world where, you know, it's web first, and the internet is king, and we expect access to our information. We expect to be able to edit it and export it and work with it. So this transition from a focus on the physical care of objects to a wider view is really key. And in a sense, you know, you can step back and see how it mirrors the kind of progress that museums are making, actually. You know, museums are great at caring for objects, and that's key. But it's just as important now to make audiences care about the objects too. And in order to do that, we need to care for more than just the physical aspect of objects. We need to care for the stories and the context, how those objects have been used over the years, so that we can facilitate and gather and care for the stories around the objects. And so even in, you know, through the course of my years working with collections management systems, it's grown from, you know, just a technologist view sitting with a registrar to conversations with the education department. They hold a lot of the context around these objects. The social media manager, working with these objects in current conversations every day, and caring more about the digital life of these objects, how they're circulating through digital networks. It's a huge opportunity, and one that our current CMSs just aren't built for. So, you know, the vision is to build a new kind of CMS, and I would love to get into that a little bit. But the short-term steps that we've taken thus far, I think, are important too. And I wonder if I might talk about some recent projects that have tried to bridge that gap a little bit to bring us from this 1990s view to a current view. We've essentially, in my recent projects, have dealt with it in 3 steps. One is to just get the data out, just getting data out of this system in such a way that it's portable, easy to use. Sometimes just showing that thumb drive that holds all the institution's data to a conference room of people is mind-blowing, because there's this perception that, oh, the collections management system is this giant immovable object, and that's the only place, excuse me, that collection data can live. But actually it can be portable, it can flow, and that is an important realization. Second step is to figure out a way to get data in more easily, right? And so that can be an external data store, where that data from the collections management system can be mingled with data from other systems. And there's a few different ways that museums are doing that these days. And then the third approach after those 2 are really to build things. There's no better way to explore, look at, improve an institution's data than to share it, show it, and work with it. That third step is where you really get into examining the organization around collection data. And I truly believe that there's an opportunity to rethink collections management in a way that rethinks organizations. What would it mean for an educator who's putting together a lesson plan to know that that lesson plan will be adding to collection knowledge? What would it mean for that public programs coordinator who's putting together a program with half dozen works from the collection to know that that program and the information and context surrounding it will be a part of the life story of that collection object? Those ideas, like the idea that the everyday work of a museum can actually be adding to collection knowledge, which is held and kept and cared for over the years, I think can be transformative. And so I would love to talk further about how we might get to a place like that.
That's why we're here.
That's why we're here. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Thank you for that, Chad.
Sure.
All right, Coven, you are up now.
All right. Well, thanks, Alex. So yeah, I started my career in museums actually as a collections DBA close to 20 years ago. And so in those 20 years, I've had angry phone calls, I think, with about half the people participating in this webinar probably, so, which is very exciting. But what that means is I think, even as I've moved on to sort of different roles in museums, I still end up thinking of most digital projects at museums as fundamentally being collections projects. It's sort of like, I feel like I kind of run home at some point in almost every project I do. But like Chad, I mean, I remain startled that collections management systems are still functionally pretty identical to what was available to me 20 years ago when I first started. I mean, we've had cosmetic upgrades, performance improvements, et cetera, but structurally these systems are still basically the same as they were. As Chad said, they're basically inventory management systems still. But I think what's interesting about that now is that, several decades in, we're now starting to see more registrars adapt their workflows to these systems rather than the other way around, which I think actually potentially makes evolving or changing these systems far more difficult, because now you have multiple generations of registrars that have never worked in any other way and don't see these as systems to be improved, but rather as systems that feel intuitive to them because that's what they've always used. So now collections management is in terms of as thinking of it as a data management problem is not a sort of abstract or evolving issue. It's one that really looks like, well, we have an acquisitions module and we have a constituents module and we have an exhibitions module, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think in the olden days, we had more registrars sort of pushing these systems to try and make them better. And I don't know that we're seeing that as much now. Certainly, from medium and smaller size institutions, I don't see that. And I think the push to improve these systems is now coming from outside of that. It's from your web team, it's from your interpretive or education team who need this collections data to drive other types of interactions. And these folks are not even really pressuring these systems to change too much because they're instead developing workarounds. Instead of saying, well, hey, all collections management systems should have an API as a matter of course, we're building them. And so, I think that in and of itself is an issue. But I think, beyond that, I think the fact that these systems have not really evolved is now creating actually larger problems. I mean, even thinking of just the issue that Chad mentioned of, that a lot of these systems still rely on seat licenses. That in and of itself means sort of more expansive workflows for developing and maintaining collections data are difficult to do and frankly unaffordable for most smaller institutions. It's like, well, we can't pay for an additional license, which means our curator can't get into the system. And again, everybody develops workarounds around those things, but it means that at its core, like these are still systems that are managed by one, maybe two people, even at large institutions. And so I think that also means that, there are the ancillary things that sort of have not really become part of this workflow that should. I mean, conservators are still basically out in the cold. I mean, decades later, there's really no management solution for the data that they produce out there. And I think, it creates this sort of unique and strange problem in the museum world where we actually have software systems that are holding us into previous ways of approaching these issues. And it's so often it's sort of, conservatism or bureaucracy that holds us back from thinking more expansively about problems. But in this case, it's actually like, it's literally software that prevents us from doing more. And I don't mean to say that as like, as a way of bashing the vendors that produce this software, because this is a low margin market. There's just not a lot of money out there to produce better systems. The consortia-based model of developing software within this sector has not produced fantastic results so far. So there's not a lot of other models out there. And so, I think those are my concerns, that, we're at a point where there's actually maybe not a lot of incentive to think about this problem differently. And, incentive both in terms of improving the way the work is done, or incentive in terms of a financial incentive to the companies that might make these improvements. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Oh,
Thanks, Coven.
Just as you were warming up.
Yes, you're on a roll. Nik, do you want to round us off?
Yeah, maybe I'll just provide a bit more context into this. I'll first off start saying there's a few people trying to get in, but we didn't know whether this was going to be, of interest or not. And clearly it is. So we clearly have a problem that we collectively need to fix. And I think Coven, correctly identified, we got to partner with the vendors on this one, because it is such a low margin environment. And BPOC, we tried, some of the vendors here and some folks here might remember, we tried to have this conversation before at a fateful MCN a couple of years back, and it clearly still hasn't been solved. So we figured now is the time, and we'll just keep going. Right now we've organized, or actually haven't scheduled 3, but the process is some consultants, talking about this stuff, and we'll talk about this as long as we need to get some, some more clarity, because I think, we see from the museum side a more broader perspective of what's going on. And oftentimes, we come in when there's a problem. So we really see the museum at their kind of lowest point and frustration with the system that they have. I mean, what's interesting to me is, why is it such a low margin market for the vendors, when the reason these museums exist is because of the collection? You'd think that there would be more of an investment mindset on the part of the museum to actually pay for, a system that is going to do the job that they need. And so we've worked with, we worked with Chin, on the collections checklist. We've worked with Lyrasis. We're working with Terentia now, so we get to see from both sides of the divide what's going on, and it for whatever, or for a variety of reasons, I think it is a problem. And so, what we've decided is, let's us all talk about this, from the broader perspective. We're going to get to the next, either one or series will be museums talking about specific problems. And then it'll be one or more, vendors, talking about what their challenges are. And I think, that you raised the exact crucial point, I think, Coven, because when we talked about this before, a lot of museums are saying, well, we want this and we want this and we want this. And the vendors are saying, well, that's fine, you've got to pay for it. So we are in this kind of a bit of a Mexican standoff of how do we move this forward? And I think I'll end with one of the things that we saw from a study we did on behalf of Lyrasis that was funded by Mellon, which was into collections management systems. And what was stunning to me was, when you look at the activity happening in a museum, so much of it comes out of a collections management system, or from the collections, all this kind of process and workflow and, driving job roles in museums all comes out of a collections management system. And I know, we want to give some exposure to some of the emerging collections management systems out there that are trying to think, differently about this, and maybe not getting the exposure, and then give the vendors opportunity to, really articulate, okay, how can we get to where we need to be? Because I think, we all knew this change in requirements for collections management was coming, and it's been, evolving over the years. But, since March 13th or 15th, depending on when your museum closed, it's clearly been, there is clearly a greater need to accelerate this notion of, it's about telling stories about this stuff and getting it out and sharing it as much as it is about, kind of day-to-day kind of object record management. And so those are some of the kind of questions I think we want to tackle with over there, however long this takes. And we're happy to just keep, going until we either get bored or run out of ideas or come up with some solutions.
Great, thank you, Nick. So going through the chat, I see there's some points that people are hoping to see discussed. Step D too, I see your remarks. So I just wanted to make sure that we cover some other things like, I know we touched a little bit on data standards. Valerie mentioned that a little bit, and so did Chad and Coven. So as far as data standards go, I know that that's one of the biggest challenges. What would you guys like to see happen to help remedy that challenge? And well, I'll open it up to everybody.
To everybody. Well, I think one of the things that I think a lot of the museum groups, AAM, AAMD, and those guys, and we work a little bit with that with ARCs and such, but I think that there just needs to be a little bit more adoption. And I think the part of our data collection standards too is that they don't take into account a lot of underrepresented communities and their vocabularies. I think we've got something that Chad and Coven and I talked a little bit about, is that we've got a vocabulary problem out there. And I don't see a lot of push yet to make those differences. And that's what's also going to help with some of that story collection and telling those stories and the provenance around the objects as well. So how do we change that in the field? I think that's something that we really need to look at, and I would like to see the our museum leadership in the community to take some of that on.
Yeah, and I think, to that point, I don't think you can have greater flexibility with vocabulary standards if you don't have greater flexibility in your core data model. Mm-hmm. I think this is one issue too, is that, it's not only just the terminologies that describe, that are vetted to describe these objects that can be problematic. The structure itself is somewhat colonialist, in that way. And so, I think something like, I look to like a more flexible data structure like RDF, or like what the way that Wikidata approaches that, so you can at least at the very least have sort of same as relationships between terms, where you can say that this is the equivalent to this, or this roughly means this with these modifications. And I think, to their credit, I think some of the systems are better set up to handle that than others. But I feel like that's a real in terms of bringing in community input. I think the data structure itself and the flexibility of same is very critical.
Totally agree. And I think, I imagine a software system that can make it easier to do the right thing. Even a simple, use case like vocabularies. Wouldn't it be great if a system, in place at an art museum might go ahead and recommend an artist name that you've half typed in, and go ahead and put a ULAN identifier next to it and say, is this the person you're talking about? There are software solutions for that are some better than others and some clunkier than others, but we're at a point now where that is possible. And that idea of a software system coming in and making it easy to make those relationships, to make those vocabularies work, and even to, certainly to Coven's point, different parts of the collection might need different data structures, and to put a one-size-fits-all data structure across an entire art collection doesn't do service to certain parts of the collection. And so that flexibility is certainly key. And from a technology standpoint, that's well within reach.
Great. So on kind of that same thread, how do you guys feel about customized systems versus configuring a system to fit, that institution's needs, since so many different institutions require different data standards. They have different collections. I just want to hear a little bit more about that kind of controversial topic.
Well, I guess who has custom systems? I know Cleveland Museum of Art has a customized system, which I believe, and again, and as consultants, you three may get this question as well. It's like, what is the best collections management system for me? Or, what is the best ticketing system for me? And the answer is always the one that you're going to invest in and support and have somebody who is appropriately trained in it. I think there's so many times, and you guys probably see this as well. You come into an institution and they've gone through three, not so much on collections management, and maybe we should talk about why that is, but a museum is more than willing to drop a ticketing system and go and find another one, on a fairly regular basis. And I think Jenny made a good point about migration, and that's the real problem, because and maybe tying that back to standards, if you haven't really been applying standards when you've been putting your stuff into your collections management system, getting it out and putting it into another one may be a real challenge, and that cleanup or conversion or whatever is required clearly is a barrier to, if you're frustrated with your collections management system, well, it's interesting about, if you're frustrated with your ticketing system, you start looking for other vendors and you do this conversion. But if you're frustrated with your collections management system, it seems like you just grin and bear it. I mean, that's kind of, isn't that, I mean, don't you find that?
Well, I think to a certain extent that's true. Although I think what's interesting, we had an earlier conversation where I was talking about FileMaker as being a place where museum data goes to die. But I think what's interesting in museum, I don't think often it's so much anymore a question of like, well, should we buy a collections management system or should we build our own? Because I mean, building your own, like a bespoke solution is really like out of reach for almost everyone. I mean, it's just not practical. However, what's interesting is that I think what you do see at a lot of institutions, and here I imagine Jeannie Choi is going to smile slyly, but you do have these sort of like rogue databases that appear to accommodate certain types of things, where it's like, oh, well, we created a FileMaker database for this one exhibition, or we couldn't get the system to handle the narrative text that we wanted, so we built a FileMaker database over here. And in like the strategist in me just recoils in horror at that thought. But what actually I think is interesting about some of those is that you have people sort of creating, like curators in particular, creating databases that match their mental model of how the collection is structured and how it works, which is not necessarily how a registrar thinks about the collection. Those are very different problems. And so, I feel like there's, as much as I sort of get frustrated about FileMaker, I feel like there actually is something to be learned from these sort of rogue databases. Like, well, why did you structure it that way? Like, why, why does this database need to exist? And sometimes it's as simple as, well, we didn't have enough seat licenses, and the curator needed to manipulate the data, so here we are. But sometimes I think it's more like, well, I don't like the way it does the data there, so I made my own,
Well, I think it's also interesting if a lot of institutions who have a collections management system that maybe has a web portal to it, so Embark, Gallery Systems, Past Perfect now, and some others. People, staff tend to use the web portal version to discover collections information rather than the system that they have. Sometimes I think that's a seat issue. And sometimes I think it's purely a ease of use, so, somebody has made the effort to create an interface to collections information that is, more usable than the application. And you see that I see that quite often.
Yeah, this build versus buy conversation I think goes to the heart of some of these issues. I'm always, reading up on the next brand new transformative museum that is spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a brand new building, including a brand new infrastructure for the physical care of objects and ways to get those objects around the brand new building. And then they plunk down cash for a 1990s content collections management system to take care of the information around that collection. It just doesn't make sense to me. Now those are the big flashy new museums. But the real opportunity, as Valerie talked about earlier, are these smaller museums. And certainly to Koven's point, when I'm brought in on a project for those, I'm sometimes happier to see that FileMaker database or that rogue Airtable than to know that there's information hidden behind a MS SQL database, layered in a 1990s collections management system. There's a flexibility there, at least in FileMaker and in a spreadsheet. That is a starting point, sadly.
And for those who haven't seen it in the chat, Doria actually made a really good point around small institutions. She says, as someone who wears many hats in a small institution, I want to minimize the amount of time that I spend in harness to a collections management system, wrestling with it, trying to personalize it, learning how to make it fit, working on data migration, etc. My primary allegiance is to my collection, and my collections management system needs to help me serve my institutional mission, not drain time away from it.
But isn't that the promise of software and applications, to make things easier for you, to be a tool,
Oh, that's the promise, and it is seductive, and we all want it so. And sometimes that promise is fulfilled, but not always. Mm-hmm. And sometimes just as we get to know a system and we love it and we link everything into it and we become wedded with it, then suddenly we get the disruption of software upgrades or changes in the market. And then this beautiful system that we've married ourselves and our institution and our collection to is suddenly obsolete. And everyone's like, oh, why are you using that? Don't you know about the new, data XYZ, and you think, ugh, and maybe you don't have the budget to do that upgrade. And so you have to make do with what you have. And my sense is that a lot of people working at small institutions are creatively making do with what they have. And we may have a lot to learn from some of those folks who have been working since the 90s and figuring things out with maybe old and broken and patched together systems, but there may be a lot we can learn from that creative patchwork solution.
Well, and I think to Richard Light's point, I think one thing, and to an earlier point about, how are these different from sort of just a generalized content management system when, is that these are sort of repositories of institutional memory, but because they are imperfect systems, it does mean that there's a whole lot of context that is sort of assumed or inferred from the way the system is structured. And I think that in and of itself probably creates problems for migration. It's like the registrar knows that, well, if this field is blank, that means this.
Yep.
If these 16 fields are blank, that means this. And for 5 years in the 70s, we used tripartite numbers for some reason, and then we stopped doing it. Like there's all this inferred context that is not explicit in the system, and that's all institutional memory. And there is when you move from one system to another, like a lot of that goes away because now you don't know when there's no data in this field, what that means.
And I think that's an opportunity. Like as we dream big about a next generation collections management system, we can dream about things like a Git style repository where we keep changes, like those labels from 1932, that label text that we cringe at now from 1980. That's actually institutional memory. And wouldn't it be interesting if we saved each state of each field? And not only that, wouldn't it be interesting if we had that context that you're talking about, Coven, to where, you know, that probably Connecticut question mark in the location field, we had some context that there was a registrar back in 1976 who didn't quite know where that piece of furniture was coming from. But if we knew who and when made that entry, that might be really helpful information down the road. And so not only saving the object information, but also a little bit of the context around that object information is really interesting for that next generation software.
And I think that's,
So-
you know, if you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'll let you finish, Nick, and then we'll move on.
No, I was just saying, so there's, you know, some of the thread is around this notion of, so what I'm hearing is, so libraries, archives, collections, you know, so it does more and it's easier. Is kind of what I'm hearing. And actually Cristiano makes a really good point. And I think this is, you mentioned it earlier, Coven, when we talked about it before, just the kind of mindset around this. So Cristiano is saying that the CMS implementation is run as an IT project, which is part of the problem. And I think that speaks to, you know, certainly the data, the surveying we found that it's just embedded across the whole institution. You know, it's not just in this one department. It's controlling stuff from everywhere. And I think, you know, certainly where we want to get to in this series is this notion of a more functional, more broadly applicable management system. And I think, you know, lyricists who have a suite of kind of, you know, library archive, collection management systems, I know they're looking to figure out how to bring those things together. I think Microsoft hosted the Torrentia. I don't know if you saw that. So they're thinking about this as a more embedded kind of management system across the whole institution. And I think there are others out there, a couple of the cloud-based systems are starting to think about, okay, how does this affect other areas of the organization? And so maybe, you know,
you talked a little bit about that in terms of, you know, a lot of our corporate clients use a content management system. So they've got, you know, modules for various different things, but they're handling a lot of media as well.
and I think Axial, they're trying to bring their diverse systems together too. So I think it seems like the field is moving. So I guess maybe, you know, part of what we want to talk about is how do we help speed that up?
I think, I mean, related to that, one thing that I do see emerging, apologies if I'm taking us in a very different direction, so feel free to, you know, we can U-turn if need be. But, you know, is certainly with museums I've worked for, an emerging thing that I see is a lot more museums that either do not have physical collections or whose physical collections are a rather minor part of what they do. And, you know, so, you know, a big chunk of what they quote unquote collect might be, you know, oral histories, you know, videos, other, you know, ephemera like that. And I wonder in some cases, you know, that because a lot of these collections management systems don't necessarily treat kind of non-physical objects as first class objects or at least sort of don't deal with them well. If it causes a sort of shift in the mindset of some museum personnel of like, well, that's actually not a collections object, even though it clearly is, you know, like certainly, I mean, you know, an interview with a historically relevant person, if it were written down on a document that had singed edges, you would absolutely regard that as an object in your collection. But if it's, you know, an oral history recorded on someone's iPhone, you might not think of it that way. And, you know, when I think of sort of where I would like to see collections management systems go, I would love to see them begin to think sort of more expansively about all this sort of ecosystem of possible things as collection objects, because I think more and more museums are starting to collect these as really like key parts of their collection.
You're muted, Ellen.
I just wanted to put out there, you know, and this is shown up in the thread too, I mean, why isn't there one universal, let's catalog the world system? You know, why is it not, you know, a button in Microsoft right below, you know, PowerPoint, where everybody everywhere has access to this same system? And, you know, as we get more and more into crowdsourcing, that ability to collect those stories, that ability for others. Now, there's always going to need to be the curation of the data. I think that that has to still, you know, take place. But as we try to open up our institutions more, you know, why are we not going that direction? I mean, is it, you know, because we're going to wipe out all the vendors, or is, you know, how is that support going to happen within that? But, you know, how big can we take it?
I mean, I feel like wiping out the vendors is, I mean, you know,
lots of
well, no, I just mean like, you know, but I think one problem here is sort of that, you know, that I see developing as we have this conversation is that, you know, there's no critical mass of registrars demanding this standard or this functionality. Like, and if I were a vendor, I would say like, well, I'm happy to build that thing for you, but I have no idea if any of the 3,000 other museums that we service are going to want that thing. You know, so I don't know if it is worth my time to bring on the developers to do it. You know, and so I mean, I feel like there's a bigger problem here than just it. You know, it's sort of not just, well, what things do we need the systems to do? Because I feel like a lot of the vendors, certainly those that are present on this call, are probably capable of making those things happen. It's just a question of like, is there critical mass in any one of these directions that would encourage, you know, frankly, all of the vendors to go in that direction, you know, and you know, I guess that's where some standards come into play. But, you know, I think accreditation and pushing on that side of it is probably maybe part of this discussion as well. But
don't get me started on accreditation. Okay, I'm going to bite my lip. But I did want to. There was a couple of who was it? Karen Kierstead was asking about open source systems. I think, and that's a really good point. But I think there is a bit, you know, talking about business models for the vendors, you know, that is a problem. And so if you look at, you know, Lyrasis, collection space is open sourced. You know, but I think the problem they had was the fact that it was open source, you know, so a number of service providers, you know, took that system and started supporting it. And it just wasn't, you know, the scale wasn't there for it to be supported, you know, the business model. So I know Lyrasis have brought that back in-house, and, you know, they're trying to support that in a maybe a more traditional way. But I think, you know, it's hard enough for museums to get their own kind of internal resources to support a collections management system, let alone an open source one, and let alone contribute back, you know, the evolution of the functionality to it. I mean, it just, you know, I just don't think the model is there. That's part of the challenge, I think.
I would love to connect to some of the nodes that Valerie and Coven and Christiana too have brought together around the organizational possibilities. And so that idea of a non-collection staff, and I think, you know, of a social media manager or something like that, being able to add something quickly and easily to the collection data is one that is really important, and goes to that idea of change management, organizational change. Like this idea that everyone can be involved in this enterprise of caring for collection data is one that's important. And the nuts and bolts of a system like that would be some sort of a notification system, even within the collections management system, so that a certain number of people were notified when an object changed, when the status of that object change, could authorize that change if needed, or just know about it, so that the data and the stories around the collection are, in that sense, kind of permeating throughout the organization, and becomes not just a siloed activity of a collections department, but becomes the activity of the museum as a whole. And so this idea of like, where does the software end and the organizational issues begin is really interesting.
So Brian raises a good point about, he says, banks have software developers, auto part companies, all these people have software developers. Why don't museums have software? And would that solve the problem?
No.
Right. I don't think so either.
I mean, solve the problem. I guess I'm just trying to shift a little bit to sort of, I think far too often we get a little too sort of like, well, we can't do this. Like that, museums could never have some of this capacity in-house, never. And I think that there are small organizations, there's huge organizations that have made the decision in 2020 that that's a core competency to have on staff. Even if that core competency is just to provide good relationships with outside vendors or contractors or strategists, to just say that that skill is something that we might need in this space to connect up with, to sort of be that translator between the archaeologist and the database administrator. So sometimes you need that skill in-house.
Yeah, Nick,
oh, sorry.
I just to say, I would side with Brian on this. Like, I see it as a core competency. In the same way that we would never likely go with a vendor who had no museum experience, had no idea of the culture and the workflows currently within a museum. It would just require so much onboarding and contextual like hand-holding. Wouldn't it be awesome if there was developers embedded? Of course.
So Step D2 actually. This is on, sorry, Coven, I'll let you go in just a second. Actually made a really good point. It would go a far way, but how do you justify the developer, especially in smaller institutions?
Well, you can't. I'm sorry, like having embedded developers, like, I mean, looking at the layoff patterns in the last 6 months, like it's made pretty clear that for most institutions, these are not core competencies, frankly. And so, I mean, we're headed towards a place where it's like only the largest institutions, progressive institutions, are likely to have software developers on hand. So I just don't see that as the way this problem gets solved. But also, I don't think better collections management is actually a software development issue. I mean, eventually at some point it becomes that. But I mean, I think, we have a bigger issue of, even getting back to some of Richard's earlier comments about, linked open data, for instance, thinking of objects in a linked context. Like these are sort of structural problems, and conceptual ones of like, well, we are kind of not thinking about this data in a modern context. And it's hard to me to say to some random software developer that we just hired from a bank at our museum to say, okay, now you have to solve this structural collections management. Sorry, I'm sounding angrier than I actually am, but I just like, I mean, as lovely as it would be for every museum to have software developers on hand, like I don't see that happening in 10 years.
Could I say something?
Sure.
I feel like
just on that point, I don't think Coven is wrong, but I also don't think it's as convoluted as we're making it. I don't think that our data, museum data, is not extraordinarily and dangerously complex. People talk about data, they talk about their challenges in a wide variety of sectors and a wide variety of industries, and there are business analysts and developers who are trained in understanding user stories, which are simple things as I, as a curator or whatever, want to do this to be able to do that, and translate that into something that works in a system. Now, yes, there's a huge issue in justifying paying for a developer for smaller institutions because this institution hasn't looked at saving man hours or making something efficient, where a person has to do something with 10 clicks or send emails around, as opposed to doing it inherently in a system and saving hours of work. So there's a work to be done by the institutions, I think, to understand the efficiency that they can gain from some of the system improvements that they can have. So I think it goes two ways. Sorry, I'll stop talking there because I can rant on. Sorry, Coven, I didn't want to.
Yeah.
I think I agree with you, but I think there are certain things we need to understand that aren't dangerous.
There's an interesting, just in the chat as well, and I'd love to open this up a little bit. Jeff Stewart from Harvard notes that there are other types of systems out there that might be models, institutional kind of knowledge management systems, get at what we're talking about in terms of a shared authority, gathering institutional knowledge, but also that, you know, Brian brought up earlier, how different is this from a content management system on the web? And I remember thinking that as well. Like the first time you export data from TMS, pull it into a plain Jane, you know, Drupal or something like that, you've essentially created a new collections management system. And then your question is, okay, what happens when I add things here and not there? That becomes an institutional question. The data is the same.
So there was an important point brought up by Karen Kierstead that I definitely wanted to make sure that we touched on today was shared solutions and consortiums, and what your thoughts are around that, and if you think that's a viable solution. She started listing off a number of organizations and consortiums that, and stated that the list is growing.
So those are providing a shared, is it like a multi-tenant collections management solution, or is it?
A shared model, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, is that, you know, every museum is a snowflake. You know, are they likely to want to be part of some, you know?
Well, I think Past Perfect is a good example of that's what it essentially started out as. It was the, you know, AASLH is, you know, trying to really standardize data collection and some kind of similar interface across a lot of small institutions. And then there are other organizations, the main museum network, that, you know, slurp that data, and then they have a common, you know, a web interface, which really allows for a lot of people to access a great number of small institutions, at least, you know, in one place, kind of thing. So I think that those models work really well, and I don't think that that the industry necessarily thinks of themselves as snowflakes. So I think that there's a lot to be gained by, you know, as much as possible, you know, creating those consortiums and using those systems cross-institutionally.
I mean, it's true, you know, it's Past Perfect. I mean, what is their installed base? It's like 1/3 of the number of museums in the US, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And you'd think, I mean, I remember, I'm looking at Danielle now. At one point, Gallery Systems had this kind of shared network, shared discovery, I think, wasn't it? So, but you had to be, you know, you had to have, I think it was just TMS. I don't think it was Embark. And so you became part of this kind of shared discovery network. That went away, did it, Danielle? Or is it still?
I think you're talking about the eMuseum Network project, and that did inform some subsequent functionality, but right now it's kind of laying low while we develop out some API standardization. But I think that's what you're talking about, eMuseum.
That's right, yeah. No, it was, you know, one-stop shop to search across, you know, collections for anybody who was in the network. But are you saying, Valerie, there is something like that with Past Perfect?
No, I think that you know, that's where they want to go. That's what they were originally trying to do, was to make it such that there would be someday in, you know, in the sky, there would be this giant web portal where everyone could access data across institutions. And I think that was one of the objectives in the early days of development.
Yeah, we see this in our European projects. Sorry, am I okay to jump in?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm working, you know, I'm with ZCOM, and I think that it might be just more of a of an un-American sentiment for now, at least, because we actually get the buy-in nationwide. This is a project I'm referring to in Norway, where again, they've kind of on their own decided that it makes sense for all of the historic sites and museums to go with one product. So I think it makes a lot more sense, and I'm kind of surprised we haven't seen more of it over here, but certainly
no, you're not surprised.
Which is not to say you don't have an implementation kind of committee set up to talk about the common data fields and then where people will diverge. But it is possible, I think, again, with the flexible data structure and a web-based product, vendors can do all of this. It comes back to the buy-in and money, essentially, and funding. So for us to see that in Norway and even in Finland with the Heritage Board project, where again, we've got these consortia that say, yeah, we're going to do this and we're going to fund it for several years. And it's just a different mindset. So I think a lot of that is breaking down this notion that every museum is special in the US and somehow they can't work together.
Well, I also wonder too, I mean, if in Europe, I mean, you have Europeana, which, you know, whatever its successes or failures, early on established this notion of, you know, that collections data is data, you know, that it has a life independent of its utility for managing physical collections, you know, and that alone sort of created this a sense of like, oh, this data has meaning beyond that one use case. You know, that I feel like that sense is dawning here in the States, but you know, without a project like that sort of forced that awareness on us, it's not there. And I mean, it's in many ways like why, you know, I think it was kind of interesting to me. I remember when I first came to the Met, having been at the Indianapolis Museum of Art in the collection, you know, in the registrar's department and managing collections data there, and then going to the Met where those were separate functions. Like they're, you know, like Jeannie was managing, you know, collections data and collections access. And then the registrars, I don't think I met one registrar the whole time I worked at the Met. Right. I mean, I guess they're there, but that it was interesting because right from the beginning, those were clearly sort of separate functions. And I think that is rather unusual at museums. Certainly in the States, it's very unusual. And I wonder if we might see more of that.
Seth is saying, and I thought there was some consortia going on in Canada. He says there's some consortia big in Canada and Connecticut and Minnesota. Be interesting to know what, again, this is, we've touched on this a number of times, you know, kind of mindset, cultural approach, you know, that maybe it's somewhat some of the barriers to addressing this.
So I know one thing that we've kind of touched on a little bit is workflows and processes and how that impacts the use of collections management systems in an organization. So I wanted to hear all of your thoughts on what some sticking points are with that, and you know, any of your experiences.
So one of the things that I see is the inability of a lot of collections management systems to help us manage a number of the off-the-shelf products that are available for project management or exhibit development. So the integration of that, I just haven't seen, and it's a little bit frustrating. So, you know, so we've got, you know, Trello over here, and, you know, over here we've got, you know, different, you know, TMS or something. So some of that, I'd like to see a little bit more of that be top of the list for a lot of the CMS developers.
We should talk to Salesforce. We just bought Slack.
Yep.
Certainly part of the issue there, and this is a conversation that would have to happen early on in terms of actually building our dream collections management system, is one that Dan brought up in the chat a little earlier. How much should these be like a single unified system that actually incorporates, you know, some project management elements and exhibition design and things like that? versus some, discrete services that feed perhaps into a central data store or talk to each other in efficient ways. So a more kind of modular structure. I think that's a great question. There seems to be a move now, partly because of some of these deficiencies that we've talked about with collections management systems, to treat these as discrete services that perhaps can talk to each other. The challenge there is that the collections management system then becomes just one provider of data to a bigger system. And then someone has to decide, okay, which one is the actual collections management system, is the source of truth among all of them. Great questions.
Could I say something here? I just wanted to point out, there's a consortium called DINA. I don't know if anybody knows that, the DINA consortium. And they have, instead of trying to make people use their system or a specific CMS system, they have devised 3 levels of how to interact or integrate with their system. And they help the institutions to develop that. And that's anything from, if you have an API, great, we use the API. If you don't have an API, then maybe we specify which fields you need to have these and these standards of data so that you can have an appropriate ETL process or extract process. And then a third one is, if you don't have anything, then we might be able to go in and help that institution to actually develop something to share that data with the consortium. And that's on the realization that without sharing the data, the consortium doesn't have the power that it actually, not the power, but the utility that it desires. Now, this is mostly natural history data. So there's, but that's interesting, where the consortium or the supplier actually goes ahead and said, right, we understand you have different needs in different systems. Let us help you fit into our platform or our framework, and not trying to make people or institutions switch to something completely new, for example.
Yeah, and I think, in more of a sort of startup model, we've got, I don't know if Micah Walter is, or anybody from Micah Walter Studio is on this call, but we've got Micah Walter, who's out of one of the new incubated companies, has built a platform called Accession that's designed to do something relatively similar, which is, basically keep the data in the repository of your choice. And then to, I think, Brian Kennedy's question, then it basically kind of maps all that data into a GraphQL database, which then you can query separately. So, which would be interesting to see if more of these sort of like middle layer platforms like take off, if that actually, in a way, sort of like makes the purpose of the collections database far more clear. And it's like, okay, you know what, actually, let's not make it do all these other things. Let's just make it a really, really rocking inventory control system and nothing else. And when we need these other things, we can get to them through, these other means, which is messier, but certainly looks more like how, web development looks now. I mean, when I think of, when we're building websites, it's never like, well, what's the one database backend that's going to solve our ticketing problems and our event scheduling and our, it's like we go to different third-party solutions for all those things now. Yeah. Richard Light, I'm sorry.
I was just the advantage of that is that your API, that thing that connects everything together, can be your snowflake. That's the thing that holds that institutional knowledge for the institution to say, this is the only way that we connect our parking database with our collections management system, and no one else wants to do that.
Yeah. Well, and I have to say also, I mean, talking to Micah about a project I'm involved with, there was a certain advantage as far as grant funders were concerned that it really reduced the complexity of that problem to a line item in the budget, where, it could basically say, well, it's going to cost X dollars for each individual repository we're bringing into this ecosystem, which was just like the simplicity of that was so wonderful, you know, where I was anticipating we would have to have 3 months of meetings to hash that out. And he was like, no, this is what it costs. Each repository is this much, you know, and there's something wonderful about that. I also want to mention something that Richard said, which is, you know, if collections objects had unique persistent identifier URLs, oh man, that has been something I've wanted for so long. You know, the idea that every object, physical object in any museum collection anywhere would have a persistent identifier that would travel with it when, you know, objects are sold, like that would be so wonderful. I would love to see that happen. But you know, I think that's another thing of like, you know, like that's kind of a software problem, but it's mostly a structural problem, you know, that we're not thinking of collections data that way, you know, yet anyway.
You know, that was one of the long-term goals of the .museum TLD was to do that. Does .museum still work? I don't know. Who has that now? Is it ICANN? No, EDUCAURS I think have it, don't they?
That, Coven, that last thing you said, museums don't think of data in that way, I think is key. There's, you know, there's an idea of data in the museum world that is divorced from objects and object care and the things we do every day, but it's really the data, you know, going back to that first handwritten ledger by the first curator of your museum, that's data. And that was passed on and turned into index cards. Those index cards got filed into a first database, which got, you know, went through some messy translation into a second database, and on. And that data, from a museum standpoint, we hope will last as long as those objects do in our care. And so each of these systems is just a handholder along the way for that data. And we are just stewards of that data, just like we are the objects and the connections those objects make with people. And so this discussion becomes one of, okay, during the, you know, 20, 30 years we have at our museum, how best to steward that data, add to it, enhance it, make it more usable with whatever systems we can apply to it, so that the professionals 20 years down the line don't look back at us and say, oh goodness, you wasted it. Either you wasted an opportunity or you just totally dropped the ball. But to look at that data, you're right, in a new way, as a long-term investment, right? Touched by human hands, full of bias and history and all the problems, but all the opportunities too of museums.
So we have about 15 minutes left in this discussion. So if anyone else has additional questions or things that they would like to hear discussed before we end today, please add those into the chat.
I think there's so much in there. You know,
I think, where to start.
Right. It was like, this
it's a good sign.
It's a good sign. You know, I think
Yes.
It was so optimistic to think that we would get this, you know, 3 meetings out of this. So I think, you know, Alex, you and I will figure out how to just,
right.
We clearly got to have more conversations around this. And
it looks like that we might need to add a more technical conversation to this series as well. So if there's anybody who would be interested in participating in that, please reach out to me. I will include my email in the chat.
And maybe we'll kind of paraphrase the chat as well when we share the recording. And when I say we, I think you know what I mean. But yeah, what are the big things we haven't kind of covered yet? I mean, is there a big gap of something that we just kind of want to, you know, put a marker in to say, you know, this is something that we've got to talk about? Chad, is Valerie, Coven, anything you haven't?
Well, you know, I will say I mentioned this earlier, and Jeff Stewart just brought this up too, which is, you know, I mean, the fact that conservation is not and has basically never been part of this discussion. to me remains one of the biggest sort of resource holes, you know, when I think about museum work. I mean, the fact that we still don't have systems for managing conservation workflow and data is, I mean, is an immense problem. You know, and then the few attempts to try and solve this problem have, you know, unfortunately kind of fizzled out. But I mean, the problem is still there. And so, you know, guess where that data is going? It's going into FileMaker databases.
Well,
so,
there are a couple of vendors have a conservation module now. I
well,
think.
Yeah,
does that do the trick?
No, it does not. So, I mean, you know, the ability to sort of add treatment reports and that sort of thing is one thing, but to manage the actual workflow of a conservation lab where you're doing daily treatment data, you're managing multiple types of, you know, of materials and treatment types, and, you know, you've got all sorts of scientific data. So, I mean, I think, you know, collections management systems are doing a decent job at managing sort of the output of that process, but actually, you know, something that really manages the entire process end to end, the same way that collections management systems do for registrars, really we don't have yet. Although if anybody knows of something, I would love to hear of it. But yeah, I feel like that's a big one for me.
Yeah, Brian says similarities to facilities management tools, databases. Yeah.
I would say too, you know, if there's one thing that perhaps we could expand upon, I'm concerned mostly about the resources for an endeavor like this, like convincing people of the importance of infrastructure. Like, you know, we think about physical infrastructure, and we've said this before. Museums are good with that. You know, if the air handling system goes down, there's an immediate, you know, investment. There's not the sense that data is the same sort, requires the same sort of infrastructure. And so there's an element of this that, you know, we need to reframe the conversation and say that for museums today, this is vital infrastructure. In fact, you know, given that this conversation is happening in the middle of a pandemic when physical buildings are closed, this is the infrastructure. These stories are absolutely critical. And if you don't have the digital infrastructure, then you can't operate in a time like today.
So why is that? Why isn't it regarded? I remember, you know, this was manifest once when I was at the Getty and we were doing this disaster planning. And so we were, you know, working with everyone, talking about scenarios, you know, flood, wildfire, you know, earthquake. And one of them that we threw in there was the possibility of an EMP. So electromagnetic pulse that would destroy all technology. And when you talked to the curatorial team about that, they were incandescent with joy that there was a remote possibility that all this technology might one day just go away. And I think that's kind of at the root of the appreciation of what this, you know, what a collections management system is doing for the institution and how significant and important that is.
And it's not something, and I've talked with museums a lot lately about this, it's not something that's going to go away once a vaccine comes around.
I mean, do we think there's been a change in attitude as a result of the closures, that institutions are having to do a better job, you know, connecting online? I mean, is this the right moment now where we can have more of a conversation about the value of data? Though it would be received in a different way, I guess is.
Yeah.
So our institution had about 800% increase in use of the collections management system during lockdown. And it allowed the institution to not seamlessly, nothing was seamless, but at least transition over to tasks that they could do remotely That was anything from data curation to data enhancement, to basically checking dates, but enhancing their data. And that massively increased and showed the higher echelons or the decision makers that this was a valuable thing. So I definitely think that this has put it at the forefront, that the digital knowledge that we have of our collections and the accessibility to that knowledge is hugely important. Not just for Born First Digital if we are recording things on site or if we are making it easier, but also just to keep things going, to create resilience and sustainability within an organization. And I mean, unless we understand that, then there's no selling point, to be honest.
That's a great point from Elise.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say from where I sit, a lot of smaller and medium-sized institutions that I've talked to seem to still regard these as relatively siloed problems. The increase in attention to their digital efforts is often regarded as we need to redesign our website problem. Or we need to hire an extra social media person problem, as opposed to a sort of more integrated, we need to shore up our data infrastructure so that we can more quickly respond to these sorts of things. And that does give me pause that some of these changes may not be, I mean, for some institutions, they certainly absolutely will be long lasting, but I wonder if on the whole, they will be across the sector.
Yeah.
I feel like I get to be the negative guy today. I'm just going to complain about everything and offer no solutions. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
That's why I paused with that question, Nick, because I've seen as many, heartbreakingly, I've seen as many museums just pining away to reopen and planning reopening.
Back to normal. Yeah.
Right. As soon as possible. With perhaps some triage, as Coven is saying, like, oh, we need a part-time social media person, or the website sucks, but not a sense of, oh, this is actually an opportunity to rethink the way we approach collections and digital and our audiences. I think we'll come out of this with a lot of institutions seeing that they lost an opportunity.
A lot of smaller institutions that, I mean, I've got clients that are, the way that they've been dealing with this is through screen share, back with the home computer that's sitting on the curator's desk. And they really have used a lot of this opportunity, though, to do a lot of data cleanup, which I think is great. It's putting them in a much better position. And we're getting calls to do, to help with those kinds of things too. So I think that they are, they're definitely scrutinizing their data more because they have the time to do that for once, whereas before the director just needed to know who gave that thing. Now the director actually cares that, somebody said that it's 17 feet by 4 feet when it's 17 inches by 4 inches, so little things like that.
A real Stonehenge problem.
Exactly. Where is that in the House Museum? So I think that there's been an opportunity here that a lot of institutions really have taken advantage of, and I think that heartens me, and I think it also may lend credence to why we have 100+ people today. Is that they have had the time now to kind of look in cross-institutionally at some of this data.
There's an even more interesting chat. The chat has been so good on this call. We had to share that out as well because it doesn't. I mean, we've only reflected some of it in the conversation. So we will do something around sharing that chat out as well because I think that's important and that will inform how we think about these discussions going forward. Oh, can everyone just download the chat? I guess you can, yeah.
I feel like 100 people are trying to find out if we can.
Right. and the other Zoom tip I realized by accident when we started this call was that you can actually move video windows around and reposition them yourself. I did not know that.
The more you know.
It's been a voyage of discovery, this call.
Well, so we have a few minutes left. Is there anything else that you guys want to add before we wrap? No? All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. I mean, this is amazing. We were not expecting this many people to show up, and we are so grateful for everybody who has shown, grateful to our panelists, grateful to everyone in the chat who has participated and spoken out. As Nick and I have said, there will be more webinars in this series. The next one, we're looking to focus around the more of an institutional perspective. And it looks like we may also be looking at adding a tech webinar to focus more on the technical aspects of collections management system challenges, since there are so many and there's just so much for us to discuss.
I think Brian as well added another. Thanks, Brian. He added another one to our series.
Yes, equity and accessibility, absolutely. Right. We want to make sure that that is covered. So thank you for that, Brian. If you are at all interested in participating in these webinars, please reach out to me. I will put my email in the chat again. And thanks again, everybody, for coming. This is amazing. And we look forward to the next discussion.
Happy hump day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Chad,
Thanks,
Valerie,
everybody.
Coven. Take care, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Go back to your CMSs and prepare.
Everybody waiting to see if we say anything else before they log
Nick,
out.
I wanted to say,
hey, Christy.
Hey, sorry, I didn't put my face on there because I don't want it to be like a distraction, you know. So, but thank you so much for hosting this, Alex. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Good to see you.
I
haven't seen you for months.
Yes, I haven't seen you. And also, Alex, I keep thinking about your digital curation. Your digital curation paper that you wrote many years ago.
That was so long ago.
That's another topic.